Good evening and welcome to We the People, brought to you by the League of Women Voters of Minneapolis. I'm Catherine Shreves, your host tonight, and with me is Karen Moe, who's Deputy Director of Neighborhood and Community Relations with the City of Minneapolis. The City of Minneapolis has been working on a plan called Neighborhoods 2020, and that is what we're going to be talking to tonight. Thanks for coming tonight, Karen.
Thank you for having me.
And I think I'd like to start out with maybe a brief history of how Minneapolis has empowered neighborhoods over the last 30 years, starting with NRP and then going to the community participation program in 2010, and now looking at Neighborhoods 2020. So if you want to give us a little history,
Sure.
That would be great.
Awesome.
Okay.
So then, you're right, policymakers went to the state legislature in early 1991, 1992, to request that there be a pool of funding to support neighborhood revitalization efforts. And with that, the state decided to create a pool of funding that would be used to support something called the Neighborhood Revitalization Program, which we refer to as NRP. At that point, those funds were used to create an NRP office, which was actually a separate quasi-governmental office that had a governance board that included the City of Minneapolis, Hennepin County, Minneapolis Park Board and Rec, as well as some other partners, government entities like the school board and the library board at the time. Those government entities all agreed to create a pool of funding that would be used to support these neighborhood revitalization efforts. With that, the state legislature created a tax increment finance district, a TIF district as we commonly refer to it, and the revenue from that area, and it was predominantly the downtown, section of downtown, the tax revenue that was created from that area then was used to create a pool of funding, the NRP funding that was used to support efforts in the communities throughout the city to revitalize their neighborhoods. Previously to that, there had been neighborhood organizations organized, whether they were official nonprofit organizations or not. They kind of have a long, varied history. But at that point, with the influx of funding that came in, kind of shored up the need to have this citywide structure of neighborhood organizations covering all aspects, all parts of the city. At that point, the Neighborhood Association Network was established. There was the pool of funding, the NRP funding that came in. At that point, it was a 20-year commitment, so from early 1991 through, it sunsetted in 2010. And at that point, the estimate was that it was going to capture around $400 million of revenue from that geographic area that would go into this pool of funding to support those efforts over the next 20 years.
So is that $20 million a year for 20 years? Was that the?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
That's a lot of money.
It is. It was a lot of money. There is still some of that money left in the network.
Okay, so there are 70 neighborhood organizations in Minneapolis.
Correct.
But maybe 80 some neighborhoods.
Yep, 84 neighborhoods is what we
Okay.
say, and that includes some industrial areas.
Okay.
But 84 neighborhoods represented by 70 neighborhood organizations.
Okay, so the money from NRP, so this was to empower neighborhoods to decide, kind of in a grassroots effort, how they wanted to make their part of the city more livable. So
Correct.
how was that money used? I mean, what was the main use of the NRP funds?
So the NRP funds were used, we would refer to them as project-based funding. So either to initiate projects or to leverage other funds for projects. And to your point, it really was focused on kind of at the neighborhood, at the community level. Those folks had the opportunity to kind of prioritize the needs of their community. There was some general ideas around some investments that had to be made to address things around housing issues, other concerns. Crime and safety was another one that was kind of a hot item, I think, for a lot of folks in the community at that point. But those funds were used to support a variety of revitalization programs, including things like home rehab loans, pre-purchase programs, so for folks buying homes, as well as some economic development projects, such as Midtown Global Market benefited from it, as well as other community building or community prioritization programs that the community decided was important to kind of solidify their community.
Okay. So when a lot of it was used as housing, was that because of an aging housing stock in the city and people were leaving because of that? Or, I mean, what's the...
My understanding of it, looking back at it, is that there were a lot of concerns regarding people leaving the city. Honestly, I think there were concerns around crime and safety issues in the city, and whether or not the program was really designed, I think, to stabilize middle-class homeowners. To secure that group of folks staying in the city. That was really the intent of the intention of the program at that point.
So 20 years later, it changed. That money, the TIF money, ended.
So there was a sunset date, as there are with TIF districts. There was a sunset date. At that point, the city decided to go back to the state legislature and request that there be an extension of that program. And so they went back and they got a 10-year extension to 2020. At that point, the other government entities decided to not participate in that program, meaning that the tax revenue captured from that area went back to the appropriate government entities that benefited from it. So it was really just the proportion that was left for the city of Minneapolis when the tax revenue is determined, split between those different entities. So at that point, there was one main shift, which was the reduction in the amount of funding that was available due to those other government entities taking their portion back to their budgets. In addition to that, at that point, the city, I think, had recently, had responsibility for the Target Center. And so when the city of Minneapolis went back to the state legislature to request that there be an extension of the TIF, not only did the funds, were they reduced because other government entities took those funds, but they also requested that some of those funds be used to alleviate the debt for the Target Center. And so at that point, there was a reduction in the funding. And in addition to that, there was a shift in the funding. So the purpose, again, like I said, of the NRP program was project-based. And in 2010, the city decided to focus more on engagement. So how are we as a city supporting efforts at the very community level of engaging all of our residents?
So that was 2010, so that was the last 10 years.
Correct.
And that's the community program, community participation program.
That's it.
And so what does it mean to have citizens engaged? What was that?
Great.
And how much a year was that money? Wasn't $20 million a year?
Nope. And so we're about $4 million going out to the neighborhood association. So quite a change. And we refer to it, you say it beautifully, the community participation program, but we refer to it as CPP, just so you know. You can use the
we'll just start
acronym.
saying that acronym. So much easier.
Yeah, exactly. I think there was just a shift in really at the city level, thinking about civic engagement and what does it mean for us as a city to be more authentically engaging all of our residents and making sure that they have the opportunity to weigh in on decisions that are impacting their communities. And so I would say, I think one of the beautiful things about the Neighborhood Association Network is really the opportunity for anyone in the city, no matter where you live, to have information about projects that are impacting your community or impacting the city, have the opportunity to figure out how to get involved in those, how to weigh in on those, without necessarily having to come downtown to City Hall to do that. We also know that some projects impact different communities in different ways. And so the opportunity for the different communities to come together with their community, their neighborhood, and weigh in on something that might impact them in a way that's different from other communities.
So now we're in 2020.
Correct.
And so the city has been looking at what is the new iteration.
Correct.
It's not NRP, it's not CPP.
Right.
What's going to be the acronym for Neighborhoods 2020?
Yeah, I don't know. We haven't gotten there yet, Catherine. We're working through a lot of other details right now. I would say that with the sunset of the TIF district in 2020, with that on the horizon, that led to the city having to have some conversations and decision making around how were we going to fund neighborhood organizations moving forward? And then to your point, what really was going to be the focus of the program moving forward.
So with the TIF district expiring, the city gets those same dollars.
Correct.
So the city could or may decide it would use those same dollars that had been part of TIF and dedicated directly to CPP, would just fund the new Neighborhood 2020 plan. But who knows if that's how it will be handled. But that's one option for funding it, I'm assuming?
Yeah, and that is the option, that's the direction, the kind of initial steps the city has taken is exactly what you're talking about. So that revenue from the TIF district still continues to be generated. It just now, instead of going into a pool of funding over here, just dedicated to neighborhood organizations, come into the larger pool of the general fund for the city.
Right.
But in addition to the revenue coming in, the funding to support neighborhood associations is also coming into this pool. So the revenue will come into the general fund, and then the idea is that the funding for neighborhood organizations would come out of the general fund.
Right,
Yep.
right, okay.
Yeah.
So what is the city exploring in terms of what Neighborhood 2020 will be focusing on? I know that initially the city has contracted with CURA, which is Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota, highly
Correct.
regarded, highly respected group, to do look at the new plan through a racial equity lens.
Correct.
So let's talk about that and explain what that means.
Sure. One thing I will just acknowledge is with a couple things. So first of all, the city, every 4 years with a new council, establishes a strategic action plan for that council, and it really sets out the priorities for the city, right? And that helps elected officials, decision makers, prioritize really what are the needs of the community right now, and how are we going to prioritize decision making, right? I don't know, we haven't had the chance to talk about this, but with this city council, they actually passed the first strategic and racial equity action plan.
Okay.
I think it actually might be the first in the country. So the conversations around just addressing racial equity are broad. They are not just kind of focused on the work that we're doing or the lens that we're taking with neighborhood associations.
Very good, okay.
It actually is part of the overall strategic plan of the city
Okay.
and the commitments of the city. And so we see this coming up in a lot of conversations around a lot of planning the city is doing. We saw that with the comprehensive plan 2040, where there was a real focus on addressing some racial inequities that exist today in the city because of policies from the past. And so with the conversations with Neighborhoods 2020, that's also this, the idea of looking at the work that we're doing through a racial equity lens is also coming into the work that we are doing. Okay. And you're right, our department, Neighborhood and Community Relations, brought the Neighborhoods 2020 framework to the City Council in May of 2019 when they adopted the framework. And with the framework, they also directed the city coordinator's office to work with a contractor to do an analysis of neighborhood organizations using a racial equity lens, and then bringing forth a set of recommendations with that lens applied to it. At that point, the city coordinator's office did contract with CURA, as you mentioned, who does have experience, and they were selected specifically because of the experience that they brought and the research that they've done using a racial equity lens. For this project, the framework that they're using is, they have three main components that they use when they apply a racial equity lens. The first is a contextualization of the information, and so really looking at the problem in terms of understanding the information that they're looking at from a systemic view, and in this case, particularly systemic, looking at the situation from a racial equity or systemic racial view, and we would say looking at it in terms of the inequities that either have been generated or furthered or not impacted through the information that they're looking at. The second component is really centering people of color, or some might say folks that have been historically unengaged or underengaged in whatever activity you're looking at. For us, the real focus is looking at folks of color and how they have been engaged through this process or been impacted through the funds or the programs from these funding sources. And then the third is generating solutions after looking at the information and then bringing forth solutions that are not just solutions maybe that have been tweaked to have a different impact, but actually looking at it in terms of how are the solutions creating reparative actions to address the inequities that have been either furthered or caused through the work.
Okay. So I'm trying to,
There's a lot of information in there.
there's a lot of information. So one of the things that I want to talk about, some of the disparities that Cura had noted, not from other programs. I don't want to disparage the work that NRP did or CPP did,
Right.
but just the disparities in home ownership or in engagement of renters in neighborhood organizations, and why.
Yeah.
And so talk a little bit about how that it can be improved, how we can engage those groups, or what reparative work would look like.
So first I'm going to take a little bit of a step back and just say, in terms of the work that Cura has done and is doing, is they are still, we're still in the process. So it's lovely to come and sit and talk with you, and then also acknowledge we are still not quite yet at the point of making final recommendations. So in terms of the contextualization and the centering people of color in the analysis, what they have done is three kind of primary things. So one was to do a literature review of of research that has been done on the Minneapolis network of neighborhood associations. And there has been a handful, quite impressive amount of research that's been done on our network of neighborhood associations. Again, looking at that information with the framework today, right? And so that might be different than the understanding or the frameworks that were used to do the research in the past, but really looking at it from this racial equity framework today. They did a literature review of that information. They also analyzed data that we provided them from the NRP program and from the CPP program, and looked at the programs, not all of them, but the ones that we had demographic data from and enough information to analyze using that racial equity lens. They looked at that data, analyzed it, and then looked at, again, focusing people of color and the systemic issue. They took that lens and looked at that data, analyzed that data. And then the third thing they did was hosted interviews or information gathering with people, right, through a variety of meetings to actually gather more information and, again, kind of analyze it through that racial equity framework that they're using. What they have found was, at this point in analysis, what they found is that predominantly or disproportionately the folks that were making decisions about setting priorities for communities and then creating programs to address those and then implementing those programs were disproportionately white when looking at the overall demographic data of the neighborhoods and the city. They also looked at the people that benefited from those programs, and again, the people that benefited from those programs were disproportionately white. And so with that information right now, we are moving into the next phase of looking at, so what are the recommendations to address that, and then what also would be reparative in terms of how do we address some of the inequities that maybe have been driven by some of those decisions or the programs that were implemented.
So let's talk a little bit about the disparities. You mentioned that the programs were predominantly designed by white people and benefited white people, which of course they benefited white people because they were designed by white people, so that would be maybe what they would know, right?
Yeah, and I would also argue, I think at the point, again, remember back in 1990 and when the program was being designed, I wasn't here at the time, but when the program was being designed, I think the focus of the program was to focus on
Can we say it? Stemming white flight?
On stemming white flight, on stabilizing the middle income homeowners, which was predominantly white people.
Okay.
It still is. Actually,
Yeah.
we have one of the country's largest disparities between homeownership by folks who are white and people of color. And so, of course, it makes sense that if that is the focus of the program, and then you design the program to address those are both the people who got involved in the program as well as the people who then benefited from the program.
Right. But let's talk a little bit about the disparities in Minneapolis and in Minnesota, because I think that we have this belief system that we're so dang special. We're just also Lake Wobegoниsh, and we could hardly believe that everybody isn't doing, above average here.
Right.
But talk a little
Right.
bit about the disparities in home ownership and education and incarceration. Do you have any of those statistics at the top of your?
I do not.
Okay.
Again, I'm the Deputy Director of Community Engagement. If you want to talk about how we engage different communities, I can go on ad nauseum about that. In terms of racial equity analysis, I don't have those figures at hand. What I do know is that we have some of the nation's largest disparities in terms of access to jobs, home ownership.
I know education disparities are
disparities, yeah. I would
some
also,
of the worst.
Right, and then I would also just say, in terms of context, remember that we are a city that is, at this point now, more than 50% renters. And so there's also a shift in where our city is at. I do want to say that some of these problems are systemic because the system prior to NRP being funded, the system was, and we were just talking before the program about racial covenant policies that predate 1990, but that have had a huge impact on who lives in what community, who has had access to live in what community. So when the funding came in, it came into a system that was already inequitable.
Right.
I think not only is that true, but also true is that our city is changing in ways. And so I think what we are seeing is a lot of, I think what you're getting at is that when we talk about this information, for a lot of people, people experience discomfort because it challenges what they believe, not just about Minneapolis or maybe the neighborhood association and the fabulous work that they're doing. It also challenges themselves in terms of what fabulous work they're doing in this, right? And I think one of the things that Cura has done really well is to try to build an understanding that this isn't necessarily about an individual or about an individual organization, that the system has been inequitable, and the money coming onto it has either maintained that system or, in fact, in some cases, driven that inequity.
Right. So that's making me think of Jim Crow of the North, the TPT movie video. You can watch it anytime.
Fabulous,
which talks about mapping the covenants all throughout Hennepin County.
Right.
Because they're all electronic, and that's a process that is underway, but it's all being done by volunteers.
Yes.
So if you have any interest in making a difference in terms of mapping the prejudice that existed, which is what I think you're saying, that NRP came into a system that was not beneficial to people of color because they had not been able to buy into certain communities because of those racial covenants. So
as well as other policies. The racial covenants is one part of it, but there are, it's policy after policy after policy kind of laid on top of each other that has created a system that is inequitable to start with. Cura's findings suggest that the influx of funding into that system actually potentially created more inequities in our city. I think their findings also suggest that with CPP there was a change in the funding formula that got a little bit more towards kind of an equitable distribution of funds. The question I think where we're at today as a community is, are we trying to maintain the current system in terms of taking an equitable approach, or are we actually trying to address the inequities that exist? And if so, then what does that look like? And that's where we're at today.
So I thought that when I was reading about Neighborhood 2020, that there was going to be a focus on people who were paying more than 30% of their income on housing, and also people who were being gentrified out of their neighborhoods. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So Cura has started at this point to move into the next phase of making a recommendation about program goals, and with program goals, and also quickly moves into funding and how the current pool of funding that is being allocated to this work will be allocated distributed throughout the different neighborhood associations. So they have looked at, I think, multiple formulas, and the one that they are bringing forth is one that, to your point, does rely on looking at communities that are being gentrified or at risk of being gentrified, and then households where they have a higher housing burden, and that is to get a little bit at we do have some members of our community that rent, but also have sufficient income and maybe also still have choice in where they're renting. And that is different than just using renters as one variable to kind of indicate as a what do you say, to measure folks that maybe don't have choice in housing, right?
Right.
But we also have some homeowners in some of our communities that do own their home, but have a high energy burden in terms of, housing burden in
Okay.
terms of they're paying a lot of money for their housing compared to their income.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the timeline right now, as I understand it, is February 14th. The city will be looking at things and considering, and then maybe the 24th is when they're going to come up with the proposal. Do I have those dates right?
You have one in there, right, and then one that may be a little bit off. So what I'll say
Okay.
is Kira has completed the racial equity analysis.
Okay.
Again, that first kind of phase of this. And we've been having multiple community conversations around it. We wanted to bring it forth to council, the city council, so that they had the opportunity to receive it and then review it and ask some questions about it before we get into the next phase of this, which is coming forth with the program recommendations based off of the analysis. So on Wednesday, February 12th, Kira will be presenting the racial equity analysis to the committee of the whole at 1:30 p.m. On February 24th, we will be releasing the proposed program guidelines. And as the city does, we release a document and then there is a 45-day public comment period. So those will be released on February 24th. And then the public comment period will close on Friday, April 10th.
Okay, so March is a big month.
So
do
March-
you expect to be getting a lot of feedback?
We hope we do get a lot of feedback
Yes,
on
good.
this. We really do.
Good.
I think anytime we get a lot of feedback, that's an indication that people are engaged with the city and the work that we're doing.
Excellent.
And then after that, we'll take a little bit of time just to make any adjustments and then bring the recommendations, the full recommendations to City Council, probably in early May.
Okay, well, thank you to our guest this evening, Karen Moe, Deputy Director, Minneapolis Neighborhood Community Relations, David Rubador, who's the director, happens to be in New Zealand, so he couldn't be with us tonight. But it gave a great platform to you, Karen, and you did a great job explaining this. Thank you.
Thank you
very
for having
much.
us.
Okay.